The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, or morning, or evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series, and this, of course, is unit number 6. So we're at the end of the program, and I hope you've got something very useful out of the program, and more importantly, you've actually implemented some of the things that we've talked about. I've been very practical in terms of what I'm suggesting. So I just want to check the audio before we go any further. Could I just get an indication, just if you could type in the word clear in the question box on the right-hand side, that will at least let me know that I am not talking to myself. Thanks, Desiree. Thanks, John. Hello, Mary. Thank you. Good. Okay, it sounds like I'm coming through loud and clear, which is great. And as always, this will be recorded and you'll get a set of slides as well. So I'll endeavour to get that out to you this afternoon, and you'll get a recording and a set of slides. So just relax and enjoy. But at the same time, I'd urge you, if you've got comments or questions, to type them in to the question box the moment you think about them, so that I'll stop and pause during the presentation and respond to those questions. Remember, I'm the only one that sees the questions, but nevertheless, while you think about it, the best time to ask it is right at that point, and that's the way we make this more interactive. All right, so we're talking about effective meetings today, and before I get stuck into that, let's just recap quickly on the program. So you'll note that way back, seems like a long time ago, we talked about Unit 1, which was the ingredients of effective feedback. And essentially what I was suggesting there is that you should be giving feedback every day. And I set you the task to give 3 bits of feedback, preferably positive each day, and to let me know how that eventuated. Most of us will give limited negative feedback, but very rarely will we give positive feedback for some reason. The unit number 2, we looked at your influencing profile, and we were asked to complete a profile online, and basically there were 4 different strategies for influencing anybody about anything. They included investigation, calculation, which are 2 logical approaches, and motivation and collaboration, which are 2 emotional approaches. And the key message out of Unit 2 was that you need to be more flexible in terms of the way you're attempting to persuade other people. So in other words, if plan A doesn't work, you've got plans B, C, and D. And I'd be suggesting to you to use all 4 influencing strategies, depending on the person or persons that you're influencing or the situation that you're in. In Unit 3, we looked at optimizing team performance, which was essentially around the need to be having regular dialogue with each and every member of your team. In other words, individualizing your leadership. So I'm hoping that you've got regular check-ins happening with your team members, because by doing that, of course, you are building levels of trust, and trust and aligned expectations will ultimately lead to optimizing team performance. In Unit 4, we looked at motivation, in other words, getting the very best from the people that you lead. And really, I was running through a number of different strategies there that you might like to incorporate. Of course, there's no one motivational strategy that fits all situations, as we know. But what I was looking for there is really the essence of what Daniel Pink calls autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So what he was basically saying in his excellent book was that knowledge workers, and I assume that a lot of you are dealing with knowledge workers, need to feel a sense of autonomy in how they conduct themselves in their work. They need to feel that they're developing and growing, and that is mastery. And they also need to understand the purpose of the work that they're doing. So how does this fit with the bigger picture? What's the line of sight between this seemingly trivial task and the strategic direction of the organisation. And if leaders are doing those three things, then you're going a long way towards creating a motivational environment by which your people can prosper and be more engaged. Mind you, that's their decision, not your decision. In Unit 5, we looked at the second diagnostic, which was understanding people and their personalities. And essentially what I was wanting you to do there is to actually have a fun way and a convenient way of looking at how people like to operate. And by doing that, of course, you can then use what we call the platinum rule, which is treating people how they want to be treated, rather than the golden rule, which is treating people how you want to be treated. So by flexing your approach to other people and accommodating their particular motivational and personality orientations, you're likely to get a better result. So I hope you've had some fun with that. And of course, today we are looking at facilitating effective meetings. And you might say, well, why this topic? I mean, we've got 6 topics. We could cover lots of things in this topic. Well, my view is that running effective meetings is paramount to being successful as a team leader. Reason being, you run a lot of team meetings, and if you haven't been running a lot of team meetings, let me assure you, you will be in the future. You'll also be attending a lot of meetings as well. And probably when you come out of this broadcast, you may well be quite reflectively critical about the way people run meetings, because I don't think people generally do it very well at all, which is staggering when you consider the amount of time that you and I spend in meetings each day. And if you add it up over the course of a year or even a lifetime in work, we're talking about significant time. And so it is very important for the person running those meetings, in my view, to be very good at running meetings. To me, it is a core skill. And what I've attempted to do in this Lunch and Learn series is focus on core skills. And I believe this is one of those core skills. So that's my rationale for this topic. So before we move into this topic, I hope you've had a chance to lead people with an emphasis on personality type. I hope you had a chance to look around the production area or the office and start to consider the way people are, what their characteristics are, perhaps just having some observation about how you might deal with them more effectively. So I hope you've had a chance to do that. And as always, I'm interested in your feedback. So send me an email, or of course, go to the question box there and give me some observations. I'd be happy to have a look at those. All right, and let's move on to our topic, which is, whoop, I went too far then. So what we're going to do and what we're going to cover in this topic is we're going to look at the context of meetings. So, you know, what sort of meetings are there out there? How you might structure those meetings. There are different ways, of course, of doing that. Some of the interpersonal and leadership skills required in meetings, and some ideas on how you might enrich your meetings and making them more productive and more interesting. Because I guess, and I'll say this a little bit later on in the presentation, running meetings is a costly exercise. So, for example, if you have 5 people in your team and the meeting goes for an hour and you're the 6th person, we've already taken 6 hours out just by meeting for an hour. But not only that, while people are sitting in the meeting, they're not doing something else, hopefully. So that's actually 12 hours, because we've got to calculate the opportunity costs involved. So a 1-hour meeting with 5 people, with you leading it, costs you 12 hours. So you'd want to make it an effective meeting, wouldn't you, in order to get your so-called money back. So that's another rationale for running this very important topic. Now, I have said this earlier, but I'll say it again. Getting good at running productive meetings is one of the most critical and untapped skills of any leader. And I don't mind if you're a team leader, you're a supervisor, you're a coordinator, you're an executive, whoever you might be, you have a responsibility, I believe, to run effective meetings. And if you don't, then it's costing you serious dollars, and also not to mention the morale that's lost when people attend your meetings and find them dull, boring, and unproductive. So there are some skills that you need to learn in order to be more effective in this space. All right, so let's make this point. Meetings themselves are not productive. So there's no such thing necessarily as a productive meeting. It's what happens or doesn't happen between meetings that determines the effectiveness of the meeting. So if you think about it, meetings are there to plan, strategize, and prioritize what goes on between meetings. So the meetings are set up in order to create some clarity and some priorities around what might happen between meetings. So it's important to think about that, because you can have a fun meeting, even a productive meeting, in the sense that everybody gets a say, everybody's contributed, everyone's had a laugh, everyone's got some alignment in terms of what they're going to do. But unless anything different happens as a result of the meeting, then really the meeting's been a waste of time. So it's what happens between meetings that becomes critically important. I just wanted to make that insight early so that we understand that the meetings themselves are to set up what happens after the meetings rather than the meeting themselves. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that you don't learn something from the meeting, and it doesn't mean that you can't give a good point of view that other people need to hear, or you give your opinion about a topic that's critically important that takes another perspective. I'm not suggesting that at all. But in terms of whether the meeting itself has been productive will be dependent on what behaviour change occurs after the meeting. Okay, so what sort of meetings do we have? So I've put a little category here together to look at the type of meetings that we're involved in, and let me run through those with you. And while I'm doing that, you might like to consider how many of these meetings you attend, or how many meetings do you run. So we have we have meetings to inform people. So these are meetings where we might have a new strategic direction, or we've got a new product or a new service, and the whole objective of the meeting is to inform people about this. So we've got information meetings. We've also got, and it's closely aligned with information, is education meetings. That is where we might learn something. So any training program, for example, would come under the category of an education meeting. So this is about giving people some skills or capabilities in order to do their job more effectively, or to look at some issue differently. So we have education meetings. Now we have clarity or clarifying. So meetings can be used to clarify priorities or approaches or perspectives or whatever. So leaders should be using meetings to clarify positions and clarify priorities. So part of a meeting could be used to clarify, and I think a lot of meetings are really about clarification. Not necessarily does it mean that everyone walks out clear, but that may well be the intent of the meeting. We've got meetings to engage people. So, for example, if we've got a new system or a process that we've implemented in our business or our organisation, we may want to engage people in problem solving about how we might implement that more effectively. So we get everyone together to exchange ideas and perspectives so that everybody gets a chance to have a view, or at least to express a view. So that could be a meeting. And of course, those of you who in your influencing profile had a higher score in collaboration would probably understand better than anybody else the value of having engagement meetings, because that's your bread and butter. Of course, we could have meetings to solve collective problems. So we might have had a couple of customer issues that have occurred. And what we want to try and do is to rectify the situation and to perhaps put a process or procedure in place that will ensure that those problems don't arise in the future. So we might get everyone together and, I guess, engage them in a problem-solving approach. And then we have review meetings. So particularly in a project-based environment, after a project's completed or even halfway through a project or at itinerant stages throughout the project, we might get everyone together to have a work in progress meeting. So where are we up to? What are people doing? Keeping people informed of progress. Of course, the leader can keep themselves informed as well of progress around the table. And of course, we have meetings to make decisions. And meetings that make decisions are, of course, also collaborative affairs where the leader may delegate the decision-making process to the team so that the team collectively come up with a position on a particular issue. And that might take a little bit of time to get to, but if we can get to that, then we have total commitment around the table because everyone has had their say in the decision-making process. Now, obviously, a lot of meetings are crossovers between several of those issues, but I think it's just a very good framework for you to think, why are we having this meeting? Where does this meeting fall into in terms of categories? And of course, if you can't answer that, then it's problematic, isn't it? Because if you can't answer that, then what it does is it means that the meeting's probably going to be fairly fuzzy in its objectives, and the people in the meeting will be confused. So it's important to consider which type of meeting the meeting is that you're planning to have. All right, so if you've got any questions or comments, type them in and we'll deal with those as we go. Now, I want to just do a little exercise here in terms of cost because, you know, the reality is that meetings, as I said at the outset, cost money. Of course, they're not written into the balance sheet and we don't scrutinise them at the end of the financial year, but the truth of the matter is that every time we go offline, which essentially means we're sitting in a room exchanging ideas, or of course the meeting could be virtual as well, but you know what I mean, we can't fully concentrate on other aspects of what we do. So essentially what happens is that the meeting itself is quite costly. So let's do some sums and let's just make a couple of key points about this that are important. So you can see there on your screen down the bottom in the left-hand corner, I've just given you a little calculus that will help to work out the cost of your meetings. So the first question is, what's the average income of your team per hour? Pretty easy to work out, I'm sure. So if you could work out an aggregate cost per hour of the number of people in the room, including your own time, that would be a good starting point. And then how many of these meetings on average would a team member attend per week? So that's not too hard to work out, and usually we attend more meetings than we feel comfortable attending, but you could work that out pretty easily. So you could work this out for yourself, for example. So how many meetings did you attend? Of course, it's Thursday now and we've got Easter coming up, but essentially in the 4 days, including this afternoon, how many meetings will you have attended, or how many meetings will you have chaired? Basically, how many meetings will you be involved in some way, shape or form? And then typically, how long do each of these meetings take? You know, the standard is probably an hour, but some of them might drag on to an hour and a half to 2 hours. Some of them might be short, sharp, half-an-hour meetings. But how long do they actually run for on average? And then how many people in your team are there? Which of course is easy to work out. And then what happens is you multiply whatever that cost is that you've come up with by 2, because obviously while people are sitting in meetings, they're not attending to the other work that they're supposed to be doing. Now, you'd be surprised at the cost figure that you'll come up with even over a week. So let me give you some clue as to what those costs might be. So let's say, for example, that the average income for your, and these are conservative figures, for your team members is $31.25 $31.25 an hour. All right, so there it is, average. We have 5 meetings per week, so that's not at all unreasonable. In fact, it's probably likely that there'll be more than 5 meetings a week. And typically those meetings have run for about 2 hours. So we've actually spent 10 hours of the week sitting in a meeting. Now that's not unusual, as you could probably understand. And let's say that there are 6 people in the meeting. And obviously you double that cost because those people are obviously not attending to other work that they should be doing. And you work that out, excuse me, and that becomes a significant cost. So, in fact, what that figure actually amounts to, interestingly enough, is $195,000 a year. $195,000 a year. Now, that in itself is not alarming, but what may be alarming is whether or not we're getting the $195,000 of benefit from those meetings. That's the question, isn't it? It's not so much how much we spend, but more so about whether we get a return on our expenditure. So if you had 1,000 people in an organisation, and I know some of you in this broadcast come from companies and organisations where there are easily 1,000 people, that figure actually works out to be $32.5 million spent on meetings a year. $32.5 million. Now, for a large company, that's not a huge amount, obviously, but $32.5 million is a line item. Well, if it was a line item in a budget, I'm sure an accountant would scrutinise it and say, you know, it just had a line item there saying $32.5 million meetings. I'm sure somebody would look at that and say, well, what's that all about? What's that $32.5 million all about? Then someone say, oh, that's the amount of time we've spent in meetings. And the obvious follow-up question would be, are we getting value for that? Because if we're not, let's scrap it. So I'm not suggesting we scrap meetings, but it's a good question to ask whether we're getting value for money in our meetings. All right, so let's move on to some fundamentals now. So really what I've done is I've set the scene to say that this is the reason that we're doing this topic, and you can see that there's a significant cost involved. So therefore it's important that we do it right. So let's talk about some skills and some things that you as the leader should be aware of. Now, I'm well aware that some of you may not chair many meetings, and maybe in the future in your careers you will, so it's going to be pertinent for you at some point. Now, I know there's a school of thought out there that suggests that we should be rotating the chair so that everybody in the team gets an opportunity to run the meeting. And the rationale for that is that it engages everybody in our team meetings. I don't agree with that philosophy, and you may disagree with me, but my view is that some people will dread the idea of chairing the meeting, so the whole purpose of engaging people in the meeting they will lose sight of because they simply don't want to be doing it. So they'll just be stressed trying to get through the meeting, and not only that, their skill level mightn't be particularly high, probably not if they're not used to running meetings. So if that's the case, then either you will step in, which pretty much means why aren't you running the meeting anyway, or they will fumble through and people will walk away thinking, well, that wasn't a terribly good meeting. They'll certainly understand why it wasn't, but they still won't appreciate it being a good meeting. So I think it's a nonsense to to rotate the chair. I think it's a core competency of a leader to be able to chair a meeting. So it's important that you sit in the right place and you put together the agenda and you be prepared to run the meeting. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts and comments about that, but that's my view. I think that it's abrogating responsibility when we pass the chairing of the meeting on to other people in the room under the guise of empowerment. All right, so I think you should be doing it all the time, basically. Now, the other thing about meetings that I think is very important is to be balanced in terms of reporting and discussion. Now, I think, unfortunately, there's a disproportionately high balance on reporting as opposed to discussion. So we often use our meetings to go around the table and report back on where people are in terms of progress on a particular project or, just in their functional areas. Now, usually what happens is people soak up a considerable amount of time doing that. Other people are tuned out, and some people use it as an opportunity to grandstand. And we have a situation where at the end of the meeting, we have no time to really have any discussion. So my suggestion is, of course, we should use meetings to report. I'm not against that, but how can we minimise or reduce the amount of reporting so that it opens up a space for the team to really get into some decent discussion, which I think is sadly lacking in most organisations. What about if we plonk on the table a significant issue that's affecting lots of people, perhaps everyone in the room and others, and start to do some kind of brainstorming exercise where we can come up with some sort of a solution to the problem? I can assure you that will be a far more useful time spent than it will be just mindlessly going around the room getting people's weekly reports. You can use email for that sort of thing, or you could ask people to reduce the amount of time that they take to giving the reports to a couple of key performance indicators. But nevertheless, I think personally it should be 50-50. 50% reporting and 50% discussion, and I think that's the balance, the right balance for any meeting. Now, the other thing that I would suggest is that during meetings, when you're talking about situations or concepts or ideas or whatever, you should use critical incidents. And I know you've heard me talk about this before when I talk about conversations with people. I'm a big believer that critical incidents, in other words, events and situations that have occurred in the workplace, should be used as illustrations of key points that you as the leader want to make. Now, obviously, you don't want to be embarrassing people in the meeting, and certainly that's not the objective here, but the objective is to learn something from a tangible event, such as a critical incident, so that next time something can be remedied or changed or at least built on. So I think using critical incidents become extremely important in that case. The other important thing that I think is sadly lacking in meetings is we don't really use meetings to clarify the roles and responsibilities of people in the team. Normally these meetings, of course, are team meetings, and I think we hugely underestimate the extent to which our colleagues actually understand what we're actually doing in our work. And 9 times out of 10, they don't. I mean, if you ask someone to explain, for example, what people in marketing do, or you ask people, well, what does HR do? Or what do they do in accounts? Normally, if you're in those areas, you won't be too satisfied with the answer that you get, and it'll often be quite different to what the reality is. So why not use the meetings to give people an opportunity for 2 or 3 minutes to share with the rest of the team what their key priorities are and how they're attempting to deal with those. In other words, use it as an education meeting to identify what people do in the meeting, because obviously if people aren't aware of what people do really, but they think they know, then that's going to lead to confusion, frustration, and disappointment. So the key is use each person in the team to give a 2-minute overview of what their role is. That does a couple of things. One, it forces the individual to think carefully about their priorities. Two, it gives them the opportunity to educate their colleagues about what their priorities are. And three, it clarifies the roles and responsibilities between team members in a team. So there's a lot of good reasons, and it could be just a 2-minute overview, and you could just each week, if you have weekly or fortnightly meetings, is just allocate somebody to give a presentation at that meeting for 2 minutes. So that's something that I think is very worth doing, particularly with new teams where roles and responsibilities are not clearly enunciated. Now, those of you who might be working in a production area, but it doesn't have to be necessarily in a production area, might like to consider the virtues of standing meetings. Standing meetings can be very effective because it reduces the amount of time in the meeting because nobody likes to be standing around. So when people are seated, they tend to take more time, and research shows this. So if, for example, before a shift, I wanted to get the previous shift and the new shift taking over together and talk about the transition from one shift to the next. A standing meeting might be the ideal circumstance where I might use that. You'll find that the meeting will be short, sharp, and hopefully to the point. So standing meetings can be very, very effective. Now, if it's worth meeting, it's worth having an agenda. Now, obviously, if it's a spontaneous meeting about a crisis, there may not be an agenda, and that's fair enough. But if it's your regular weekly, fortnightly, or monthly meeting, it's really important for you to put some thought and effort into having a decent agenda because it does a lot of things. It shows courtesy to your colleagues that you've actually thought carefully about the meeting. It also gives your colleagues an opportunity to prepare for the meeting. It also keeps the meeting on track, hopefully, if the person's chairing the meeting according to the agenda. And it gives a record for whoever's taking the minutes of what can be discussed when. So it helps the person recording the minutes to know when to record and what to record. So there's lots and lots of reasons why we should have an agenda. Now, there's a few key things about agendas. They don't have to be too specific. They should, in fact, be ordered. So let's say there might be 5 things on the agenda. The idea is to order them in terms of priority. So the most important item should be 1, second most important 2, and so on. Now, why? Because obviously the energy level in the room is going to be a lot higher at the beginning of a meeting. So if there's an important item, then get it out there straight away. And of course, it sends a signal. If you're mentioning something early in the meeting, usually people will realise that, at least in their head, that it must be important. Otherwise, you wouldn't be referring to it immediately after the meeting starts. The other little tip I would give you is to look, I'm not a big believer in general business. I know that sounds a bit formal, but in larger meetings we'll do that. But the trouble with general business is that it means that it's just a free-for-all for people to just jump in and say whatever they like. If you disseminate the agenda early and you ask people to add to the agenda or to at least think about the agenda, it should nullify the need for a lot of general business. So by all means, of course, you want to give people an opportunity to say something in the meeting, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I find some meetings they might spend 40 minutes on general business and only about sort of 15 minutes on the agenda, which is kind of a bit strange. The other thing I'd suggest you do with your agenda that works really well for me is that after each item on the agenda, I would put a number, and the number is the amount of minutes that you intend to spend on that item. So, for example, I might have a discussion about the new customer relationship system, and I might put in brackets 20 after it, which basically means that I want that discussion to go for no longer than 20 minutes. Now, of course, you have the opportunity to go longer than 20 minutes if you choose, but you also have the authority to be able to say to your colleagues, be brief, we've only got 20 minutes on this topic, so I want you to get straight to the point. Or if someone's being a bit long-winded, you can say with some degree of authority and courtesy to the other person, we've only got 20 minutes on this topic, so can you keep your comments brief, please? So that works really well. And the other thing, of course, is to start on time and finish on time. People are busy. People are often going from one meeting to the next. So if you're scheduled to start the meeting at 10 o'clock, you start the meeting at 10 o'clock, regardless of who's in the room. You're sending a signal very early on that you really expect people to be punctual. And of course, if you wait for people to arrive before you start, you're really rewarding tardiness. And of course, if you reward tardiness, you'll get more of it. So start on time, and then at the end, finish on time, because it's courtesy as well for the people attending the meeting. Summarise at the end of the meeting is very important, and I'm not necessarily talking about minutes here, but I think that there's probably someone that's got a talent in your meeting who's very good at being able to get to the essence of what's been discussed. And you could actually ask them to summarise at the end of the meeting. Now, you can rotate that responsibility, for example, or if there's somebody that's just very talented at being able to pick out the essence of what's being discussed, using the agenda as a prompter, then I think it's a good idea, because the last message that comes out of a meeting is some line items around things that have been discussed and perhaps decisions that have been made and perhaps directions that people need to make at the conclusion of the meeting. And of course, that's done on the basis that what happens between meetings is critically important. So that's something that I suggest you do in your meetings. Now, this, as you can see on your screen now, meeting effectiveness will dive after a period of time, and it's important to recognise that the time when people are at their best in a meeting is early on, and that's one of the reasons I suggest that you concentrate on the key items early on in your meeting. I like the idea of an hour-long meeting. If something can't be covered in an hour, it's probably not going to get, it's probably not it's probably inefficient. So the whole purpose is to try to keep your meetings as short as you possibly can. An hour is probably a reasonable time. And what it does is that it just highlights the need to get out of there quickly, because people's interest and levels of attention will wane the longer the meeting goes on. So it's important to get to the key points early on and perhaps not spend too long on the meeting. And of course, if there are things left off the agenda, they can always be discussed at future meetings. And the things, of course, that are left off the agenda are the items at the end of the agenda, which you've already worked out are less important than the first couple of items anyway. So think about the energy levels in meetings as well. Now, one of the things that you might also like to consider is how you set up your meeting, because there are a number of possibilities here, and each of them have their possibilities, and you might like to consider it. And this has a huge bearing, more than you probably think, on how productive the meeting will be. It also will depend on what the nature of the meeting is. So, for example, if we start and move around clockwise, but if we start in the top left-hand corner, you've got theatre style, which we're all very familiar with when we're in a large audience where we have everyone seated in rows facing the front, and normally we have a group of people at the head table. Now, this is a typical example of what might happen in a shareholders meeting, for example, where the key shareholders are sitting at the top table and the people in the audience can ask questions. You'll often see this in forums as well. And you see this, of course, in television shows in Australia like Q&A. Now, the problem, of course, with this approach is that the interaction between the audience members is minimised because, of course, they're all facing the front, and that in itself might be a problem depending on what the presentation is. and the people up the front are obviously in the spotlight. So where you've got information sharing meetings, that would be in a large audience as well. That's probably not a bad configuration. Then you've got the classroom style, which we're also familiar with, where the difference is that people have got a desk or sitting behind a desk, and this is very useful in perhaps education forums. You see this in universities, where people, of course, can tap out notes on their laptop or make notes the old-fashioned way, and you've got a lecturer up the front or somebody imparting their skills or knowledge or expertise on the audience. So that works well when you've got, you're informing people and giving people some information, and that information needs to be absorbed and recorded. Now, the U-shape is very popular in the training world, where you're running a workshop and you've got the team sitting around a U-shape as it is there. Now, the advantage of this is, of course, you're going to get more interaction between the team members, because in most cases they're facing each other, which is great. So, if you want to get people to give their opinions, so if it's a collaborative arrangement, that can work quite well. And you as the leader can be standing out the front, orchestrating the meeting. Then you've got the cabaret style. Now, the cabaret style I personally like a lot when I'm running education programs, because what happens is that you can think carefully about who sits around these tables, and so you can do a little bit of social engineering, if you like, and have people sitting with people, or perhaps they might be functional teams. But at any rate, it gives them a chance to absorb information and to perhaps discuss it within small groups. So that can be very effective when you want to collaborate with the teams in the room. The banquet style, of course, is not dissimilar. It's just a bit more formal, and you probably use that when you're looking at formal dinners, where there's probably less interaction and conversation, for the simple reason that we've got a dinner involved, and also because the tables are elongated. It's highly unlikely that the people on opposite ends of the table will spend much time interacting with each other. And then you have the conference configuration, where people sit around the table. I suspect a lot of you would have your meetings in that configuration. It's a pretty good configuration in the sense that everyone's facing each other and you're closed in. And so it's great for collaboration and getting people involved in decision-making processes. So there's your choices. So have a think about that. And I think it really horses for courses. It very much depends on what you're trying to do in the meeting as to which approach you might adopt. But it does have a huge impact. And if you go to a motel, for example, and you're paying good money for it and they've set it up the wrong way, then by all means let them know, because I think what often happens is they normally set it up very formally when you really probably don't want to have a formal meeting. It's probably an informal meeting, but you want to have it away from the office. All right, now the other thing I'd suggest you might like to consider is having guest speakers at your meeting. Now, I don't necessarily mean a formal guest speaker where you're paying them thousands of dollars. I'm more about talking about perhaps other people in other parts of the organisation that might have some important information to share. Perhaps even the speaker themselves could come from the team members. And I don't think this is a bad idea. It breaks up the meeting, gives people a chance to plan, and gives people a chance to spruik about something that's important to them. So in an organisation that's functional, you might get, for example, the HR manager to come and address the meeting on the latest legislation on X. Or you might get somebody from marketing to talk about the new product range. I think this is a good idea. And you'll find that people will often welcome the opportunity to come to your meeting, because it gives them a forum for them to get a key point across, or to try and influence a certain group of people within the organisation. So how about we think carefully about doing that? Now, when I say guest speaker, they don't have to go on for very long. you can actually give them some parameters and say, look, I just need you to present for 5 minutes, and then we might have 5 minutes of conversation around your topic. So that forces the speaker to be brief and to the point. So speakers are a good idea as well. Now, here's some skills now. Let's move into some skills that you could use in your meetings in order to keep your meetings flowing effectively. One of the best skills that you can use, it's highly valuable in conversations as well, is paraphrasing. Now, paraphrasing is basically letting the other person know that you've heard them. In fact, there are 3 particular reasons or rationale. There's 3 points about why paraphrasing is so important and what it can do. The first is that you really can check to make sure that you have understood the speaker's point. So the speaker might have taken 5 minutes saying something. At the end, you can try and paraphrase by saying, so in other words, the key point that you're making is blah, blah, blah. Now, that's one reason for doing it. Now, if you get it wrong, of course, the speaker will set you straight, or should. Secondly, it lets the speaker know that you've actually heard what they've said. Now, that's important because they do want some reassurance that particularly the chairperson has actually heard and absorbed what they've said. And of course, the third reason is so you can move the conversation on, because once you've paraphrased somebody's comment, you can either defer to somebody else in the team, or you can take the floor yourself, or you can move on to the next agenda item, or whatever it might be, and can become very powerful. So there's 3 good reasons for getting good at paraphrasing and summarising what people have actually said. Okay? So that, to me, is probably one of the most invaluable skills in a meeting. Now, one of the frustrations I get a lot, people saying, well, how do I get people to be involved in meetings? Because some people just come to meetings and they sit there, or they doodle, or they play on their phone, or I can't seem to get them engaged. Well, here's how to do it. The way to get people engaged in a meeting, assuming, of course, you want everyone engaged, is to ask people to give an opinion. Now, you do this with courtesy. So what you might say is, let's say that Fred or Mary have been very quiet in your meetings. That's their normal practice. So you might turn to Fred and you might say, Fred, I notice you haven't said anything so far. Is there anything you would like to add to this discussion? Now, of course, Fred may have nothing to add to the discussion, and Fred can quite easily say, no, I don't. But if Fred does have something, then it gives them a doorway in to be able to make a key point. But psychologically, what that does is it lets every other person in the meeting who may be a little reserved know that you at any time could be calling upon them to give some input into the meeting. So what it does is it involves people by not involving them, but just by doing that every now and again, you are engaging everybody, because everybody thinks sooner or later I'm going to be asked. Now, Fred and Mary also, it's courtesy because I've actually noticed that they haven't said much, but my thinking around that might not be that they necessarily haven't got anything to say. So by asking them to, or inviting them to contribute, I'm actually showing them courtesy. And sometimes you'll be surprised how people will take that opportunity once you've opened the door for them. So that's a little technique that works extremely well. Now, of course, the other side of it is, how do you shut people up? Well, the key thing is just to paraphrase, because that's the best way to get moving into the next phase of the meeting. Now, when you form a new team, you might like to consider doing what I have designed as a team values charter, which is based on 5 simple questions. So you actually go around the room and ask everybody to write the answers to these questions. And this in itself can be a very powerful meeting. And I'm saying that because I've seen this over and over again across a lot of industries. And I've actually been very pleasantly surprised at how popular this technique has become from one of my recent books. But the first question is, if there was one value that was important to you when we meet, what would it be? So everyone writes down a value. Let's say I write down respect. My second question is, what does it mean? I say that respect means that we all get an opportunity to say our piece. 3, why is it important? Well, respect's important to me because I want to feel that I'm part of the team. 4, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? Well, if I'm not being interrupted, if I'm being given courtesy and an opportunity to finish what I'm saying, then I would suggest that that's a behaviour that shows respect. On the flip side of that, what behaviours would violate that value? Well, when people cut me off or dismiss what I'm saying without hearing me out, then I believe that that's disrespectful. So you see, you get everybody to write this down, and then you simply go around the room and ask people to share. And what you've actually created out of that is a values charter for the team, which is another way of you being able to, check the pulse on how the team's going. It also informs the team of what's important and what isn't in terms of their engagement with each other. Very powerful. You can read more about it in my book. Now, one of the simplest things that you can do in your meetings, and I'm staggered why people don't do this, is go round the table and just ask people for a win for the week. Or if you have monthly meetings, a win for the month. Or fortnightly, a win for the fortnight. It doesn't matter. Ask people to mention something that's gone right. Now, that literally will take you, 5 minutes? And you will hear some really inspirational things. It forces people to come to the meeting having thought about the win for the week, because obviously if you ask people to mention a win for the week, they've got to forage around and think about it, and clearly they will do that the next time because they know you're going to ask. So it creates an upward spiral of positivity in the meeting, and it also creates some very interesting insights into what people are working in. So just try it. It works really, really well, more than you probably think. And there's nothing wrong with it. We're going to talk about the problems, so we might as well talk about what's going well. So guys, that's pretty much brought us to the homework now. And what I want you to do is, probably pretty obvious, is I want you to implement some of these new approaches to meetings. So I want you to try something new. Those of you who chair meetings, and I know not all of you do, we've got quite a large group in this broadcast, so this might be for the future, of course, but if you are chairing meetings, I want you to try some of these things. Try the win for the week. Try paraphrasing. Put numbers after the agenda to indicate how long each item will take. Work out what sort of meeting it is, and so forth and so on. And if you do that, you probably shouldn't be surprised when one of the people in your meeting tell you that that's a great meeting. And I think personally that people should walk out of meetings better off than when they walked in, because, as I said, it's a costly exercise. So I think it's really important that you get good at this. Now, you don't have to implement everything that I've suggested, but what about one or two things? Could that make a difference? I think so. So I'd suggest strongly that you do that, which I think is the right way to go. Now, I just want to quickly mention to you that we have another program coming up, but I have implemented another Lunch and Learn series around developing high performance teams. And if you or any of your colleagues are interested, we've got one starting on the 26th of April. So if you want to keep your learning going, knowing full well this is the last unit in this series, you might want to enroll in a new series. It'll be the same cost, so it's quite reasonably cost effective, I think you'd agree. You still get the video, you still get the PowerPoint. It's just that we have a different series of topics. And this is around how to get the very best out of your team. So, we look at characteristics of high-performing teams, the 4 stages of team development, tools for leading teams, the roles that people play in teams, managing conflict and negotiation in teams, and developing team culture. If you're interested, send me an email, because I do have a flyer that I'm more than happy to send to you, which has all of the different dates and topics, a little bit more information. So by all means, if you're interested, you are more than welcome to enroll in that. It's not that far away, with Easter coming up tomorrow. All right, so that brings us to the end, and I'd like to thank you warmly for your involvement in the Lunch and Learn. You have seen through the 6 units, and I'm hoping that you've got something useful out of them. I'm hoping you're doing things differently. I'm hoping that you've benefited in terms of your knowledge about leadership. So I guess at this stage I'd like to say goodbye. I wish you a very safe and happy Easter break, if that's what you celebrate, and a good opportunity perhaps for you to reflect a little bit on what you're doing. So I wish you very well, and I hope that I get to see you on the 26th for the Developing High-Performing Teams series. So I wish you all the very best. Thank you, Desiree. That's a lovely comment and very reassuring. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. All right. So I wish you all the best, guys, and thank you for your engagement and involvement. All the very best. Goodbye.